The Wounded Land, The Story of Palestine, Part 1. Before the conflict before 1948, long before warplanes flew over Gaza, before checkpoints divided cities, and before the word Palestine became a symbol of pain and struggle, there was a land of hills and olive trees, of ancient towns and diverse people. This land was known as Palestine, and for hundreds of years, it was home to Arabs, Christians, Jews, and others who lived side by side, sometimes in peace, sometimes in tension, but always sharing the same soil. Palestine under Ottoman rule, 1516 to 1917. For over 400 years, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, ruled from Istanbul. During this time, the majority of the population were Arab Muslims, with significant communities of Christians and Jews, especially in cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. The people lived in small towns and villages, farming, trading, and practicing their religions. There were no national borders as we know them today. People traveled freely between areas. The term Palestinian was not yet a national identity, but rather a geographic one. People were simply Arabs living in the land of Palestine. Life was hard, as it was in many parts of the Ottoman Empire. Taxes were high, infrastructure was poor, and medical care was limited. But communities functioned. Families passed down olive groves, wheat fields, and stories. Sacred sites like the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre attracted pilgrims from across the Muslim and Christian worlds. The rise of Zionism in Europe, late 1800s. In the late 19th century, a political movement began to grow in Europe, Zionism. It was started by European Jews who faced persecution, discrimination, and violent attacks known as pogroms. Especially in Russia and Eastern Europe, many Jews believed they needed a homeland where they could live in safety and freedom. One of the leading figures of Zionism was Theodor Herzl, who in 1896 published a book called The Jewish State, proposing that Jews should establish a national home, possibly in Palestine, which had strong religious significance to Jews. At this time, there were very few Jews living in Palestine, less than 5% of the population. Most Palestinians had never even heard of Zionism, but slowly, Zionist organizations in Europe began buying land in Palestine and encouraging European Jews to settle there. The first wave of Jewish immigrants, mostly from Russia and Eastern Europe, arrived in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They built agricultural communities, or kibbutzim, and introduced new farming methods. Some Palestinians welcomed the newcomers, others were suspicious, especially when Zionist groups refused to integrate with local Arabs and instead aimed to build a separate, exclusively Jewish society. World War I and the British Mandate, 1917 to 1948. In 1917, during World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British Army took control of Palestine, and the League of Nations, the international organization before the UN, gave Britain the right to govern the land under a system called the British Mandate. That same year, the British government made a shocking promise. In a letter known as the Balfour Declaration, they announced their support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. They made this promise without consulting the Arab population, which made up more than 90% of the people living in Palestine. At the same time, Britain had also promised the Arab people independence if they helped fight against the Ottomans in the war. The British promises were conflicting and dangerous. Growing tensions and violence. Between 1917 and 1948, the Jewish population in Palestine grew rapidly. Immigration increased due to rising anti-Semitism in Europe and the horrors of Nazi Germany. By 1939, Jews made up about 30% of Palestine's population. Jewish immigrants bought land often from absentee landlords and sometimes evicted Palestinian tenant farmers. Palestinian Arabs felt betrayed by the British, who they believed were helping Zionist groups build a separate state on their land. Tensions exploded into violent clashes. One major event was the 1929 Hebron massacre, where violence between Jews and Arabs resulted in the deaths of nearly 70 Jews in Hebron and many Arabs elsewhere. Another was the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt, where Palestinians rose up against British rule and Zionist immigration. The British responded with brutal military force, destroying homes and arresting or killing thousands of Arabs. During this time, Britain also started building up Jewish military organizations like the Haganah, which would later become the Israeli army. Meanwhile, the Palestinian national movement remained weak and divided, with no army or international support. World War II and Holocaust survivors. During World War II, the Holocaust killed 6 million Jews. Survivors were left with nothing: no homes, no families, and no country to go to. Many of them wanted to go to Palestine, which they believed was the only safe place left for them. However, the British, fearing more Arab revolt, limited Jewish immigration. This caused even more tension. Zionist groups like the Irgun and Lehi began attacking British forces in Palestine. One infamous attack was the King David Hotel bombing in 1946, where 91 people were killed. The situation was chaotic. Britain, exhausted by war and unable to manage the growing conflict, handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a solution: divide Palestine into 2 states, one for Jews and one for Arabs. With Jerusalem under international control, Jews accepted the plan, though it gave them 55% of the land, even though they owned only about 7% and made up only a third of the population. Palestinian Arabs and surrounding Arab nations rejected the plan, saying it wasn't just to give away Arab land to newcomers. They argued that the Jewish people deserved a homeland, but not at the expense of another people. Tensions boiled over. Civil war broke out between Jewish and Arab militias, even before the British officially left. Part 2. The Nakba, the Catastrophe 1948 War. On May 14, 1948, the leader of the Jewish community in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. For many Jews, it was the fulfillment of a dream. After centuries of persecution and the horror of the Holocaust, they finally had a homeland. But for the Palestinian Arabs, that day marked the beginning of a nightmare. They called it al-Nakba, the catastrophe, because it was the day their land was taken, their villages destroyed, and their people scattered across the world. The war begins the moment Israel declared independence. 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded Palestine. They said they wanted to protect the Arab population and prevent the creation of a Zionist state on Arab land. But the war did not go as planned. The Arab armies were poorly organized and under-equipped. In contrast, Jewish forces, now calling themselves the Israel Defense Forces (IDF), were better trained, better armed, and had the support of Jewish fighters from around the world. What followed was not only a war between armies, it was a war that targeted towns, villages, and civilians. During the fighting, Jewish militias carried out dozens of attacks on Palestinian villages, forcing the people to flee in fear and terror. Massacres and fear. One of the most infamous events of the war was the Deir Yassin massacre, which occurred on April 9, 1948, just weeks before the creation of Israel. Zionist paramilitary groups Irgun and Lehi attacked the village of Deir Yassin. Near Jerusalem, around 110 Palestinian civilians were killed, including women, children, and the elderly. News of the massacre spread quickly. Many Palestinian villagers believed they would be next. Some fled in terror, hoping to return after the fighting stopped. Others were expelled at gunpoint, loaded onto trucks, or marched out of their villages. Some historians estimate that during the war, over 530 Palestinian villages were depopulated or destroyed. Many of them were completely wiped off the map, and new Israeli towns were built in their place. The expulsion of a people. By the end of 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians, more than half of the Arab population of Palestine, had become refugees. They fled to Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and beyond. Many believed they would return within weeks, but they never did. Israel refused to allow them back, arguing that they had left voluntarily or that they were a security risk. Palestinians, on the other hand, say they were forced out by fear, violence, and direct military orders. Entire families left behind homes, keys, farms, and memories, never to see them again. This was the beginning of the Palestinian refugee crisis, which continues to this day. Many of those refugees and their descendants still live in crowded refugee camps with no citizenship, no land, and no right to return. Why did this happen? The causes of the Nakba are still debated by historians, but many now agree on several key facts. The Zionist goal was to create a Jewish state with a Jewish majority. Since Palestinians made up 2/3 of the population, this required removing many of them. In many cases, violence and massacres were used to frighten people into leaving. In other cases, official orders were given to clear villages during military operations. Once the villages were empty, many were destroyed so that the people could not return. Israeli leaders later admitted this. Moshe Dayan, an Israeli general and defense minister, once said, "Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. There is not one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population." The division of the land. At the end of the war in 1949, a ceasefire was declared. The land of Palestine was divided. Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. Jordan took control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip, but no Palestinian state was created. The people who were supposed to receive a country under the 1947 and plan were left stateless and scattered. Their land was taken, their homes were lost, and their future was uncertain. Life in exile. For the refugees, life was hard and humiliating. They lived in tents, then later in small cement buildings in refugee camps. The camps were overcrowded, with poor sanitation and little opportunity for work or education. Many were under the care of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, which still operates today. These refugees were not just numbers. They were teachers, farmers, poets, mothers, and children. They kept the keys to their homes, passed them down through generations, and told stories of life before 1948. The dream of return became a central part of Palestinian identity. Inside the new state of Israel. Within the new state of Israel, around 150,000 Palestinians remained. They were given Israeli citizenship, but their lives were far from equal. For nearly 20 years, these Palestinians lived under military rule. Their movement was restricted, their lands were confiscated, and they were treated with suspicion. Though citizens on paper, they were second class in reality. Israel began building itself as a Jewish state, promoting Jewish culture, history, and immigration. Palestinians both inside and outside were erased from the narrative. Their villages were renamed. Their history was denied, their absence became official. The world's silence. During this time, much of the world focused on the suffering of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Many nations supported the creation of Israel as a safe haven for Jews. Few paid attention to the Palestinian catastrophe. The Arab governments, despite going to war, did little to help the Palestinians rebuild their lives. In many countries, Palestinian refugees were kept in camps, denied citizenship, and used as political tools. But among the Palestinian people, the memory of the Nakba burned bright. They had lost everything but not their will to survive. Artists painted their pain. Poets wrote of olive trees and longing. Children were raised with the names of their villages on their lips. The Nakba was not just a moment in history. It was the beginning of a long struggle for justice, dignity, and return.